Hi, this is Joe from Vanta. In today's digital world, compliance regulations are changing constantly, and earning customer trust has never mattered more. Vanta helps companies get compliant fast and stay secure with the most advanced AI, automation, and continuous monitoring out there. So whether you're a startup going for your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or a growing enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta makes it quick, easy, and scalable. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. Get started at vanta.com.
Today's politics episode was recorded live in front of a crowd last Thursday, May 29th at the Pen and Pencil Club, Philadelphia's press club since 1892. We brought together four of the best journalists in the city to talk about last month's consequential election for district attorney. Lauren Make from NBC 10, who does the Battleground Politics segment and At Issue on Sunday mornings. Pat Loeb, City Hall Bureau Chief for KYW News Radio. Ellie Rushing, criminal justice and law enforcement reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Cherry Gregg, co-host of WHYY's Studio 2 Midday Show. And just a note on this episode, there was a bit of immigration news after we recorded the show. The Trump administration listed, then delisted Philly as a sanctuary city that could be punished. So keep that in mind when listening to the end of the episode. It's Wednesday, June 4th. I'm Trinae Ring, and we're talking politics. Cherry, Pat, Lauren, Ellie, it is great to have you all here. I watch, listen, read all of your stuff. I'm like a nerd on this. So it's great to all talk about this. And I'm thrilled to just dig into the election and what this means for Philly. Pat, we got to catch up. Last time we saw each other was at Krasner's victory party. Incumbent District Attorney Larry Krasner beat his challenger, Pat Dugan, in a landslide in the Democratic primary. He is probably going to win in November. What kind of sense did you get in that room during his victory night? It was a lot of energy for me. This was my first victory party to see, but it was interesting to see the people around Krasner. We had Senator Sharif Street was there. Council members Kendra Brooks and Nick O'Rourke from the Working Families Party stood beside him. He's built sort of a political coalition of support. So can you just talk about how he's been successful politically?
Well, I'll tell you what stood out to me about that party.
Which was crowded.
The victory party. It was crowded and it was very festive and everybody was really thrilled and knew kind of walking in that he was going to win. And he did win. And he won by a lot. And he's now going to have a third term. And yet he spent a good half of his speech being aggrieved. He spent an inordinate amount of time talking about how Dugan had outraised him. And it's kind of a familiar pattern from the head of another party, that you're a victim. Even when you win, you've somehow been wronged. But he said, I spent 7 years earning this, and someone else tried to buy what I earned. And instead of it being like very celebratory, and he did thank a few people, but it was really like, my burden.
Interesting. Because in the beginning, about 7-8 years ago, he was being touted as this like national progressive reformer on criminal justice. Do you think that same sentiment is still felt in Philly?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think the base that he established 8 years ago is very healthy and alive. And they obviously really like him because it wasn't even a close election.
Right. Lauren, on the flip side, it seems like Philadelphians appear to like Krasner, but Harrisburg kind of hates him because the Pennsylvania House voted to impeach him. You had an interesting guest recently on Battleground, Senator Republican leader Joe Pittman. You all were talking about the funding of SEPTA. He pushed back and said that, Philadelphians may not feel safe on SEPTA, and so much so that they added a special prosecutor in the system. Basically, they don't trust DA Krasner to keep SEPTA safe. He's a political lightning rod. So is he going to be a liability for the city? Because we need that SEPTA funding in about a month.
Yeah, it was an interesting moment in that interview. And I don't know that I expected him to bring up DA Krasner as we were talking about SEPTA, especially because SEPTA was cooperative with the special prosecutor efforts that were made. And the special prosecutor was put in place. And in fact, I've interviewed that special prosecutor who had told me that he wasn't taking some of those more violent crimes. Instead, he wasn't taking the shootings and the murders and the rape cases. He was going to take more of the maybe assaults or fare evasions and that sort of thing. So that was. I don't know that I was expecting him to bring that up, and whether that's going to be wrapped in. I think it depends on who you ask in Harrisburg. I definitely think that there is a divide geographically when it comes to lawmakers who are from the Philadelphia region and are familiar with how SEPTA is wrapped into daily life here, and lawmakers who are not from this area. Leader Pittman also told me that none of my he said none SEPTA, my constituents don't benefit from SEPTA.
Right, because they're like more rural PA.
Yeah, is he out he doesn't represent Pittsburgh, but in western Pennsylvania. And that, certainly there are a lot of lawmakers who represent parts of the state that are not that are not served by SEPTA, but the argument that the Democrats would make and that SEPTA advocates would make is that the economy of Philadelphia certainly benefits the entire state. So we'll see on that. I'd add one more thing. Also, just if I could jump into the party, because Pat and I were at that election, covering that election night party with Larry Krasner together. And one of the other things, Pat, that I noticed when we were talking about Senator Sharif Street being behind him was his comment about Larry Krasner having a mandate. He was the one who said that he has a mandate and talked about his progressive policies. And I just thought that was very interesting that he thought that to make that comment in that moment, if anyone had any questions about whether Larry Krasner would be continuing the policies that he's had, clearly the chair of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party thinks he will be.
Yeah. Of course, he's modified his policies slightly,
yes.
Mm-hmm. the retail theft policy and so forth. But yeah.
Jerry, on Studio 2 on WHYY, you do interviews live. And you've got a lot of callers calling in, voicing their opinion. What did you hear from callers about this DA election and their views and concerns about Krasner and public safety?
Well, we heard from listeners on two different issues. Number one, on the issue of public safety, because we had Commissioner Bethel on the show not too long ago, mm-hmm. and we asked people on a scale of 1 to 10, how safe do you feel in the city of Philadelphia? And you would be surprised how many people said 3. And I went
Meaning
back.
They don't feel
very safe. And, there's the numbers show that we hit a record low. The number of shootings have gone down. I guess in the past 30 days or so, we've seen a slight uptick, but we're still lower than we have been in the previous years. But people don't feel that safety. People said they felt safe at home, but they didn't feel safe as they traveled throughout the city, especially at night. They worried about their children a lot. And this was people from all different types of neighborhoods across the city. And so that was actually very surprising to me because I can say I've never felt unsafe in the city of Philadelphia, but hearing people give that number 3 so often was very surprising. And our audience, a lot of them do like Krasner, I'll say that. A lot of progressive liberal folks. But then there are some folks who feel like he's not doing enough. And the issue that Pat brought up with retail theft was the number one issue. People expressed concern about the fact that, you go into a CVS, everything's locked up. You can't get lotion. And people have seen people steal and run out, and then they know that nothing else will happen. A lot of folks blame, Krasner's policies for the closure of Macy's and some of the other retail outlets in our area. And so you think about that sort of ties to this feeling of unsafe, of this lack of feeling safe. And I think about when you go and see all the products locked up, how can you really feel safe? But we did speak to an expert at a later time. And one of the things that we found out is that there usually isn't a lag. If the numbers do come down, it takes a while for that feeling to actually hit people. So this isn't necessarily uncommon.
Interesting. So Ellie, you talk to families and write sometimes heartbreaking and also beautiful stories about victims of shootings in the Philadelphia Inquirer. You spend a lot of time in communities affected by gun violence. Is there one thing you hear from victims and their families about the services or support or lack of support that they get from the district attorney's office?
I think it depends on the family and the case, right? Some more high-profile cases seem to get more services, and kind of the everyday family who loses, right, a young man in their 20s might not hear from the prosecutor as they're going through, but also they're not really hearing from anyone, right? They're not ever really hearing from the detective on the case. I think in general, most families of homicide victims feel like there is no one kind of shepherding them through this process. I think also there is sometimes a disconnect of just understanding how the criminal justice system works and the court system, right? And so you're going to court kind of expecting, oh, this person's going to go to jail for the rest of their life. And right, you're overwhelmed with these emotions that are very valid. But the way that the courts work, right, where people plead guilty, and when you plead guilty maybe to third-degree murder, you can't go to jail for the rest of your life. So I think sometimes people leave feeling unsatisfied, but there's sometimes just a disconnect of understanding.
Jerry, you brought the idea of like a lag, like the numbers are going down, but the feeling may not be connecting. I was really pissed off, sad, angered about the Memorial Day shooting. 2 people died, 9 injured at Lemon Hill and Fairmount Park. It's just difficult to keep reading those headlines. How do you all kind of like work through that? I want to kind of bring you personally into it. Like, how do you work through those really tragic and difficult stories?
I mean, there's not really an easy way to work through them, right? It's kind of like leaning into that emotion and trying to put that emotion into the story so that the people who are reading those stories who don't live here or who have never experienced violence try to understand what those families are going through. I think one thing that I really thought about was that I thought back to covering Memorial Day weekend 3 years ago in 2022. I went back and looked, and in that weekend, there were 44 people who were shot and 15 people who were killed in just one weekend. And in this year, there were 15 people shot in that weekend. So 11 people shot on Lemon Hill, which every act of violence is horrible, right? And so, right, we get kind of fixated by these headlines where there are many victims, right? And that was an outrageous act of violence, but also thinking about how far we have come as a city and as a community. And I think that people still hold on to a lot of the trauma from 2021 and 22, of just the vast number of people who were being shot and killed every day. And that is why so many people still do feel scared, especially in group settings and in large party settings. I think that's where sometimes the greatest risk is. And
so during his campaign, Krasner kept talking about those low murder rates in the city in more than 50 years. But his challenger, Pat Dugan, kept saying Philadelphians don't feel safe. So, like, how does that weigh into what we saw in this election?
I know we're going to get to turnout at one point, and it's hard to take from this election, given that the turnout was as low as it was, to make a blanket statement about how people feel and how much that played into it. But ultimately, people get to vote on using whatever measurements they have. They don't have to use numbers. They can vote on their emotions. They can vote on how they're feeling. They can vote on whether they just don't like somebody or do like someone. And ultimately that's how they get to make their decisions. It is hard to try to pull really big, vast things like whether the city feels safe from this race, especially when you're looking at the fact that only less than 17% of the city came out.
I want to add something to that because so this is a little behind the scenes. We were actually thinking about, one of our producers had pitched a show saying we should do a show on the vast decrease in the number of shootings, the vast decrease in the number of homicides. And it was literally like the Thursday before Memorial Day. And we were like, well, it hasn't gotten warm yet. Let's just put a pause in it. If we make it through the 4th of July, then we'll do this show. And literally on Monday, the headline, Tuesday morning, the headline was mass shooting. I woke up to this early in the morning. And so I think to me, it's hard to say that is how I think a lot of Philadelphians feel. They feel like the numbers are going down, but let's just wait. Like I can't, it took so much for us to get to this place of angst over the past several years, and so it's hard to just release it all. And so I think people are in this wait and see mode. Can I really relax? Can I really, feel that? Or should I stay on guard? And I think most people are choosing to stay on guard.
We'll have more on this conversation after the break.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Let's talk more about the low voter turnout. It was such a stark difference from 6-7 months ago. Oprah was in the city, Lady Gaga, The Roots, everybody was showing up for the presidential. Why don't people show up, or why didn't people show up for this election?
Not as many showed up in 2024, even as showed up in 2020. I mean, it was down. The turnout was down just slightly in 2024 from where it was in 2020. So
presidential election.
Right. Presidential election. So you can look at this as part of the trend of people not showing up. I did a story about this right after the election and talked to the head of the Committee of 70 about it, who was very concerned about what this could be saying for Philadelphia and also Pennsylvania and its position as a swing state, because the turnout in Philadelphia influences the entire state. And if you don't have that, that could impact whether or not Pennsylvania is looked at as a swing state and where those numbers are going to go, and whether you have the sort of blue numbers in Philadelphia countering the red counties in the larger part of the rest of the state.
But so much money was spent in Pennsylvania. I joked around. I was like, I wasn't even getting bills anymore. I was getting like presidential election, pieces of paper in the mail. So such a difference.
Yeah, but it's very much tied to the specific race. So in 2016, very high stakes election, there was a big turnout. 2017, when Larry Krasner first got elected, crowded primary, a lot of candidates, a lot of choices. About 15% of the voters turned out for that. It was a very low turnout election. It was higher in 2021. It was, and maybe because there was mail-in voting and because of the 2020 election, it was 25%. But now it's just back down to where it was before. So I just think that the off-year-ness of it, and besides the DA, you had a city controller who wasn't challenged. And then there's a lot of judges and people that those judicial elections, people just don't, I mean, can anyone here name a judge? LA, you don't count because, and Cherry's a lawyer. But I mean, in the audience. Does anyone know any judges in Philadelphia?
They're still on the bench.
Yeah. I mean, it's just hard to vote in those judicial elections, and so people don't.
Yeah, it was pretty quiet. I was actually surprised that there wasn't more outside money put into this race to sort of pump it up, so to speak. And I saw very few television commercials. I got one text from Dugan's folks the day before the election. It was pretty quiet. We held a forum at WHYY. Judge Dugan decided not to show up. And so it was basically
Just Krasner?
Just Krasner by himself. I think that was a mistake because a lot of people didn't know Judge Dugan, even though he outraised Krasner significantly. And so I just felt like it was a pretty sleepy race. I also, and you, Lauren and Pat, and tell me if you felt this, I also feel like the Democratic machine wasn't necessarily working the way that it typically works. And part of that is because a lot of people don't necessarily like Krasner. So you didn't feel it pumping up.
It was a primary as well.
Yeah, it's a
and
primary.
So
It
it's
just
not
felt
like they're
very-
getting out against a Republican.
Right,
So
and
it's
the
a-
party
it's a
didn't
different
endorse it.
Correct,
They didn't have
yeah.
a candidate.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Certain
look,
ward leaders.
that's why I felt it was just sleepy.
It was sleepy. It was sleepy.
And I think, maybe also has to do with violence being down a lot, right? And so I think in 2021, and did you say that there was higher turnout in 2021?
There was.
Yeah,
It was in
right.
the 20s,
There was more on the line there, right? All of the ads were just about crime is out of control in Philadelphia, and a lot of people were feeling that and were like, we got to get Krasner out of here. He's, one term is enough. And then you have another term and violence starts to go down. And so I think some people maybe felt like there was less on the line, right? Even though maybe some people still don't necessarily feel safe. The city does feel more stable now than it did 4 years ago, for sure.
Okay, so did the campaigns do it right? So I don't know. You could also say maybe this was part of the strategy. Like they knew where to focus their campaign.
Well, I mean, it certainly didn't work for Dugan. I mean, this certainly wasn't successful for him. Whatever, it was, whether this is the way Larry Krasner wrote it up or not, it was successful for him. But it certainly wasn't successful for Dugan. I mean, and if you look at where the higher turnouts were, that Larry Krasner was successful in those areas. If you look at there are certain wards that tend to turn out, especially in Northwest Philadelphia, the 9th and the 22nd, Larry Krasner. And the 15th, not in Northwest, that's in, Fairmount, Spring Garden area. But yeah, those three were the only ones that had like over 26% turnout. Well, Larry Krasner won all of those areas. So he was successful in the areas that turned out. So for Dugan, he didn't get that turnout.
Do you think, is there like a civic engagement or like a civic understanding of what the district attorney does? Or do people understand? I know that might seem basic and kind of politics 101, but seriously, do people really even understand what this office does?
I'll let you talk.
No.
I wonder, and I mean, I do a lot of forums, and I'm always, in communities still doing those types of discussions. And I feel like for the people who are engaged, they absolutely do. But I think for the average person, probably not as much as they should. Do they really understand how important a judge could be? These judges are being elected, and on a very critical issue in your life, a critical day in your life, you could be in front of one of these judges and people have no idea who they are. They don't, sometimes they even skip the vote or don't show up at all. So I think that there is this disconnect of information and knowledge and impact. And for those Philadelphians who are engaged, they show up. And for those who are not, unless you literally knock on their door, you may not see them at the polls.
Whose responsibility is it?
Whoever needs the votes. I don't know. Yeah, it's individual. Yeah.
Let's talk about November. Pat, we might get a repeat in the race. There's rumors that Dugan could run as a Republican because it was like that 1,000 votes you need as a write-in. Could it be a Dugan versus Krasner again? What do you think will happen?
I think it's very unlikely it'll be Dugan versus Krasner again, but it was pretty amazing what the Republicans did in the primary. They ran a write-in vote and they got votes for Pat Dugan. So they could run him, but they don't have any money and he has maxed out contributions from his friends and labor unions and PAC. So he doesn't bring money to the table, and I think would be essential to mounting, in a city with, what do we say, the registration is 5 to 1 or
Seven,
something.
it's more like 7 to 1.
7 to 1, 8 to 1. I don't see it happening.
Lauren, during the campaign, Krasner really focused on Donald Trump, President Donald Trump. Krasner said if his ICE agents go after Philadelphians illegally, he'd go after them. He kept saying that phrase, F around, find out. Are we going to see a lot of Krasner versus Trump confrontations in the coming years?
We could. We could. And, it's interesting that this race, as you said, it was sleepy. It never got to the point where it caught the attention of President Trump, or if it did, he decided not to weigh in on it. And I wonder what might have happened if that had not been the case, and if President Trump had decided to, tweet about it and sort of raise its profile. We will never know what would have happened then. But, there are also questions about, there's been a lot of talk about sanctuary cities in Washington and how the Trump administration is going to handle sanctuary cities. Well, Philadelphia hasn't been part of that conversation. And during the Kennedy administration, Philadelphia was the most high-profile sanctuary city out there with a big court case about that. And this time, in part because of the way Mayor Parker has talked about it or not talked about it. I've talked to her about it and asked questions, but there's a way that she talks about it, even though the policy is the same. But if Philadelphia were to start to become part of that conversation, that could bring in a DA Krasner. So we'll see.
Any final words that you guys wanted to say about this election?
Vote.
That's a good one.
Can each of you tell us what you're working on now? Maybe where people can watch, read, or listen to your work, and how to follow you?
Well, I'm at Pat Loeb on Facebook and Twitter. And the big thing coming up is the city budget. Now that the DA's race has been very quiet, the council would like to begin its summer recess on June 12th. That means they kind of have to agree on a budget this week so that they can leave next week. But there's a lot of talk that they'll add a session for later in June.
All right. Cherry Gregg, you can follow me at Cherry Gregg on all platforms. Coming up on Studio 2, we're going to be talking about the New Jersey primary. It's June 10th. So we'll be doing, we'll have some folks on talking about that coming up. Also, Studio 2 is expanding to 4 days a week.
Okay.
We're currently Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and we'll be going to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, beginning on June 9th.
Good luck. I hope you have a lot of coffee. Daily show is
I know,
crazy.
I might miss my Monday, but it's all good.
And anyone can always read me in the Philadelphia Inquirer on the Inquirer's website. My Instagram is by Ellie Rushing. I don't have anything big in the works. I'm trying to get married next month and then be off for 3 weeks. So
Nice.
Congratulations.
I'm joining Cherry in New Jersey, doing some work on the New Jersey primary. There are a lot of candidates. For those of you who live in Philadelphia, it sort of reminds you of the mayoral race here in Philadelphia. There's a lot to keep track of over there. So I'll be doing coverage of the mayoral race, and I host our At Issue show on Sundays, and also produce our Battleground Politics episodes that you can find on our NBC Philadelphia website, on our app, and on our YouTube page, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. Our latest episode out right now is an interview with Dr. Oz.
Lauren, Ellie, Cherry, Pat, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this politics conversation, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.